Okay, so this is Kevin Carnahan, currently professor of philosophy and religion at Central Methodist University. And this video is responding to another video that was on the moral argument for the existence of God. And I'm going to try and explain here why the argument put forward in that video fails, or at least there are good reasons to think it fails. Maybe the better way to put it would be that the argument in the alternative video doesn't make its case. And if it doesn't make its case, then it fails. So, this said, I will put a link in the description to the other video in case you want to go watch it or watch it again. Okay, so what's the argument that's found in the other video? Well, I'm going to formalize it here. And the way that I formalize it is based on the way that the first video is laid out, not the formalization that they give it at the end. This will be a little bit different than the version that they give at the end with premises, but basically the same kind of thing. And these are the premises that they use in the beginning of the video, which is where they offer supporting arguments and things like that. So the argument runs basically like this. Objective values exist if and only if there exists an objective reference point for moral judgments. Premise 2, the only possible objective reference point for moral judgments is God. Premise 3, objective values exist, therefore God exists. Now, logically, I think that that is reasonable. I mean, there don't seem to be any significant logical problems with the argument. So I'm not going to suggest that there are any formal problems. Rather, it seems that the best way to attack the argument is to attack the premises of the argument. So let's go bit by bit. Let's evaluate premise 1. So the premise is objective values exist if and only if there exists an objective reference point for moral judgments. Well, why would we think this? The video actually gives us an argument to support this claim, which is an argument from analogy, or at least the pictures used in the video suggest this argument. It is, again, not formalized there, but I'm going to formalize it here. So the claim is that morality is like space, premise 1. Premise 2, there's no basis for judgments about spatial relationships without an objective reference point, by which it apparently means Earth. You have to be on the Earth, I guess, in order for there to be an up or a down. So I guess that's the claim. And then 2 prime, so this is another way of saying 2. Without an objective reference point, we are left with subjectivism, which is the idea that every different person has their own perspective, and there is no standard beyond the individual person and their view. So therefore, there is no basis for judgments about moral value without an objective reference point, because if morality is like space, and in space we need an objective reference point, then it's true that in the case of morality, we need an objective reference point. Okay, so that's the support argument for the first premise in the overall argument. Now, let's attack the supporting argument here, because if we can knock out the supporting argument, we can then weaken the first premise. And I think that actually, once we attack the supporting argument, it's clear that the first premise really doesn't have much to hold us by. Okay, so taking on the argument from analogy here, the question we need to ask is, do we need an objective reference point to establish objective claims about space? So the video asserts that we do, and it suggests that if you're floating around in space, well, what's up to one person is down to another person, and therefore everything is just subjective. But is that really true? Let's take another kind of claim that we could put forward if you're in space. Joe is 3 feet from Lucy, or you know, the asteroid is 10 million miles from the planet, whatever you want. Now, it seems that this is an objective claim, right? Joe is 3 feet from Lucy. The inverse is also true. Lucy is 3 feet from Joe. And this is not something that's subjective in the sense that they're worried about. It's not something that is only true from Joe's perspective or only true from Lucy's perspective. Now, do we need some objective reference point in order to have this objective claim make sense and be true? No, so far as I can see, we really don't, because this claim is established by the particular relationship between Joe and Lucy. And as a matter of fact, even the subjectivism that appears if Joe says Lucy is upside down, or as Lucy says, no, Joe is upside down, we could actually explain that perfectly well by trying to figure out what they each mean by is upside down. And as a matter of fact, as soon as we specify what they mean, Joe means that if you take my head as the standard, right, her feet are in fact oriented in the same way, and we specify what she means by it, we could establish what they're saying. And it's not just relative, whether they're telling the truth or not. As a matter of fact, if Joe looks at Lucy and both of them are oriented in the same way, and he says Lucy's upside down, that would be false. It's not subjective whether it's true or not. And this seems then that we're saying this, we can figure out by the relationship of different things. We don't need some objective standpoint, say gravity from the Earth or something like that, in order to establish objective truths. Objective truths can be established simply on the basis of the relationship of multiple different things. Now, this is probably a good thing, because if you push this very far, you might realize that the argument completely breaks down, because there is no objective reference point in space. There is no such thing. Like the idea that the Earth functions, or gravity on the Earth functions as an objective reference point, is just strange, because we exist on the Earth and are flying through space. I mean, so some people on the Earth, the people on one side, might think that the people on the other side of the Earth are upside down. And as a matter of fact, that would make sense to them, because that's gravity, how gravity is affecting them, where gravity is affecting the people on the other side of the Earth in the opposite direction. Does that make things subjective then? Does it make the up and down subjective? No, of course it doesn't, because we have localized meanings for these things, contextual. We know what they mean in particular contexts. We don't need any outside objective, I mean, the technical term here would be a view from nowhere. We don't need a view from nowhere in order for our claims to be true or false and objective in every form that we need them to be, because, I mean, thank goodness, otherwise we would be in real trouble, because we just don't actually have that kind of view from nowhere. So on the one hand, we could then say, if this is the way that the argument works for space, why couldn't it work that way? Maybe we should in fact accept the argument from analogy and say, okay, so maybe morality is like space. Maybe it is the case that the parallel works, and maybe then, since we don't need a view from nowhere, anything outside an objective reference point, a single objective reference point, in order to create objective statements about space, maybe the same is true of morality. Maybe it's the case that something is good because of a particular relationship between two beings, right? That one being and another being find what's good for them, right? And that they find a certain fit between what is good for them. And the fact that there is a fit is in fact an objective claim. We don't need any objective reference point in order for it to be good. And this would establish a kind of contextual ethics, right? That would be certainly relative in some sense. It might be relative to the kinds of creatures that you're talking about, but we already know this. I mean, we know that what's good to feed a cat is not the same thing that's good to feed a child. Why? We don't need one standard across everything. We need what fits with the particular kind of being. And in some ways, this could just be a contextual ethics. Now, nothing in this leads to subjectivism. Nothing in this leads to the claim that every individual just gets to do whatever the heck they want. Because again, it can be an objective claim about the fittingness of something between two people. It is not the case that walking around and hitting people over the head with hammers all of a sudden could become good if I just think it's good. Well, no, we would still have to look what actually fits with particular kinds of creatures. You water plants, that's good for a plant. Why? Because of the way that a plant is and its relationship to water and its relationship to us. Well, okay, you don't water a child, though you might give water to a child, right? Allow them to drink. It's a fundamentally kind of different thing. So each thing might have its own way of being, and morality might be about finding a fit between those. It doesn't seem like we need an objective reference point. So in some ways, what I'm suggesting is that the support argument actually works the opposite way that the video suggests. It undermines the claim that we need an objective reference point. If the analogy works in the way that the video suggests, the conclusion does not follow. In fact, it seems like the opposite of the conclusion follows. So that's a problem. If this is correct, then they have not established premise one, that objective values exist if and only if there exists an objective reference point for moral judgments. It might be that, it is at least possible that, there is a kind of objective value that exists without an objective reference point for moral judgments, but with contextual standards for moral judgment. Okay, but let's say that premise did, for the purposes of argument, let's ignore the fact that premise one seems on this account to have failed. Then maybe let's look at premise two and see if we can evaluate premise two and see if there are any problems with it. So premise two is that the only possible objective reference point for moral judgments is God. So they gave a supporting argument for premise one, which was the kind of argument for analogy, from analogy for space. I don't think they offer any supporting argument for this. It's just pretty much assumed, which is weird because it's such a really important premise, utterly central, and seems to be exactly what is contested as the point of the argument, but they don't really supply anything for it. What are alternatives? Could there be other alternatives for a kind of objective reference point for morality? Let's say we do need one, do need something that's an objective reference point. So again, we're setting aside that first premise. Well, I mean, there have been philosophers, this is the project of modernity, is to try and come up with alternatives that could offer you a kind of objective reference point for morality, right? The project of getting into contextual ethics is very much more a kind of postmodern project. But modernity was all about, they kind of accepted the first premise and then continued to disagree with the second premise. So it might be that the perspective of society is the objective reference point for morality. That seems kind of like Hegel's answer to this. So what's good for the society is in fact what's good, full stop. Kant suggested that reason provides us this kind of absolute objective view if we can just figure out what's consistent, right? So I should never murder somebody else, because if I try to murder somebody else, if I murder someone else, then I'm acting on the rule that everyone should murder everyone, right? This is what Kant said. And I can't act on that basis, because then I'd be willing that people murder me. But if people murder me, then I'm not free to murder other people. So Kant says reason suggests there's a kind of almost logical impossibility, or in this case, it's really a practical impossibility of doing this. So Kant said, no, reason provides you this objective starting point. What about the idea of species? Maybe the standpoint is not the standpoint of a particular society or reason, but maybe it's on the basis of species. So Philippa Foot has come along and given an account of a kind of moral realism that accounts for, or takes the standard of the species. And as a matter of fact, so the video said, well, for animals, there is no moral standard. But Philippa Foot points out that actually there is. There are, say, bad chimpanzees. There are bad wolves. The wolf functions as a part of a pack, right? Because that's what's best for wolves. And the lone wolf, the wolf that goes off on its own, does not protect the pack, actually is, we can recognize in a sense, a bad wolf. She says, of course we can understand how these things function in other creatures. This is not some standard that simply comes about on the basis of humanity. So she's even pushing further than that. What about the possibility that the objective standard is simply figured out on the basis of a calculation of what produces the greatest pleasure or the least pain? Here we find Jeremy Bentham and what's called utilitarianism, which is basically the idea that in every situation, we should figure out, well, how much happiness does it produce? How much unhappiness does it produce? Any particular action, right? Should I go out to the movies this weekend? Well, how much is it going to produce happiness in me? How much is going to produce pain in me? And how much is going to produce happiness and pain in other people? So we could actually run this. So recently we've had the problem of coronavirus, right? And Bentham could totally make sense of this, because he says, look, it used to be okay to go to the movies. It used to be morally acceptable to go to the movies because it didn't produce a great amount of pain in people, whereas it produced a significant amount of pleasure for those people who went. But when COVID-19 came, then it turned out that going to the movies spread the disease, caused death, caused greater pain. Therefore, it's morally something you shouldn't do. At no point has he appealed to God. He has his own thing that he's putting forward as an objective starting point for morality. Or you might want to push past all of these and say something like all living things, or even beyond that to environments, or the good of the planet, or something like that. I mean, each one of these seems like it could be an alternative objective reference point. So if you're going to just state as a premise that God is the only alternative here, how do you do that? I mean, that just pretends as if modernity never occurred, much less postmodernity. It strikes me as strange. Now, maybe we could posit. So let's imagine an ongoing dialogue. So let's say that our person who put forward the moral argument for the existence of God now comes up with an objection to these alternatives, all of them that I have suggested thus far. And then the person who's arguing on the moral argument for the existence of God says, well, but we could ask with every one of these, why should we go along with X? right? Where X is society or reason or species or the aggregate of pleasure and pain. We could always ask, why should we go along with X? And we could expect some answer to that. Okay, so why should I go along with what's good for reason? And Kant would say, well, because human beings are rational creatures and whatever else, right? Now, this shows, says our antagonist here, this shows that they are not the ground of their own goodness. If you have to justify some standard in terms of other standards, standards beyond themselves, then it seems like we have a problem. We have not gotten to the foundation of moral goodness. So with each one of these alternatives, there's always some higher standard against which they should be judged. Okay, so we can always ask, should I really do that which brings about the greatest pleasure? Maybe I shouldn't. Maybe there are cases where I should keep a promise, even if it brings about pain, right? And that suggests that there's some standard beyond aggregate pleasure or pain. Maybe we should say, I shouldn't always do what appears to be consistent and rational, because when Anne Frank comes to my door and asks for me to hide her, right? Well, that would be deceptive to other people if I'm hiding her. So that seems like that's not the rational thing to do. But we can appeal to other standards beyond that and say, well, okay, it seems that each one of these standards, in fact, fails to be a final ground for morality. And actually, I think that there's something to that. So maybe this is a possible response. Now, so that was the person, my other person, the person who's arguing for the existence of God via morality here. So now I have a response to that person. So they've said, well, we've said that every other standard, every alternative standard, we can ask why we should follow it, right? And that suggests that there's some standard beyond that standard by which that standard is judged. But couldn't we ask the same thing about God as the objective reference point here? So famously, this is to raise the Euthyphro dilemma, right? Which is to say, okay, so God says I should do X, but should I do X? Is there some standard that's beyond God, right, that you could look to? Is there some standard that even God might look to when figuring out what it is that God is supposed to do, right? Put in the classical framework, right? Does God command something because it's good, which would suggest there's a standard beyond God, or does God command something and thus it becomes good, at which point it seems to be arbitrary what God is doing? Well, the video offers a kind of reaction to this, because it suggests, no, you've confused things here, because that's the kind of question we can't ask when we get to God. And that's because God is different from the other alternatives, because God's being is goodness. Okay, so as opposed to the aggregate pleasure or the dictates of reason or whatever these other things are, those alternatives are not the same as God, because God's being is goodness. So God just is goodness, and there we're done. We're at the foundation. We have finished things off. So this is their response then to the Euthyphro dilemma, to say, no, the dilemma doesn't pick up. It's not that there's a standard beyond God, and it's not that God's commands are arbitrary, because God's being is in fact goodness. So we find in God's being the answer to the question itself. Now, here's the problem with this. As it functions internal to this argument, the argument for God's existence from morality, the problem is that we're begging the question, okay? So we're saying, how do we know that God is in fact the proper alternative out of all these? We say, well, we know that God is good, while the other alternatives are not, because God is good. It's to say, well, the nature of God is good. But in fact, any one of those positions could make that move, right? I mean, Kant could say, and as a matter of fact, this is kind of what Kant does say, it's inherent in being reasonable that it's good. The goodwill is the only thing that is unqualified good, says Kant. So he can make that move too. It does fundamentally end the conversation, but you haven't actually successfully argued for anything. You've just made the claim that you're starting out with the claim that you want to end with, okay? You've ended up claiming that, right? Why is God the foundation of what's good? Well, because God is the foundation of what's good. That's not a good way to make an argument, okay? So at this point, I've suggested that premise number one in their argument has significant problems, and premise number two in the argument, again, has significant problems. We could go on to question number three, and ask whether there are, in fact, objective values, or objectively true command statements. But I don't think we need to go on to that. I think at this point, we've fundamentally shown that the argument doesn't run. Now, in doing this, I'm producing a video response that is longer than the original video, which is never good in an argument. And I want to qualify with all the things that I'm not doing, because I'm not responding to every form of moral argument for the existence of God. There are some more specific kinds of moral arguments that make, say, claims like that you couldn't have particular kinds of moral claims, or that you couldn't value particular things if you don't have a basis in God. So, for instance, Nicholas Waltersdorf makes the claim at one point that it seems like in order to value human beings that are not functional human beings, right? People who suffer disabilities that are severe disabilities that don't allow them to either reason or function in society, or any of those other standards, right? So even if it's good, whether it's good for the earth, whether it's good for all living beings, whether it's good for aggregate pleasure, it's the person who suffers severe disabilities, who is drained functionally on everything else. Waltersdorf suggests, well, if you believe that, there is a value to taking care of those people, care, and thinking that those people have rights, even though they're in that kind of state. Waltersdorf argues that that would run better if you had a particular kind of God that you grounded things in. There's also Robert Adams, who argues that there's a particular kind of moral experience and moral truth that makes sense with God, which has particularly to do with responsibility, that we in fact feel guilty when we violate moral standards. And guilt is a kind of personal relationship thing. And oftentimes violating moral standards is not offending any other person, at least if we don't have God that is in fact representative of or commanding all of those standards of morality. So those are more subtle versions of moral arguments, that might get you to a moral argument for the existence of God. I've not taken on those. I'm not incredibly positive about those working out either, but obviously I'm not going to take them on here. I really wanted to take on just this kind of YouTube video. I think it's indicative of something that's actually really troubling on YouTube, which is that a lot of these arguments that are out there on YouTube are just really bad arguments. And in this case, it's put together by a group of people that they're obviously trying to use it for kind of evangelical purposes, right? By which I don't mean in the political sense, but reaching out, trying to convert people and get them to be Christians. And I mean, I myself, I'll just say I am a Christian. I am a theist. It's not that I don't believe in God. It's just that I don't believe in bad arguments. And so it kind of annoys me that there's so much of this stuff out there that just even some of the people who are making the arguments have to know how weak their positions actually are when they state them. And there's a danger that philosophy in that context becomes manipulative rather than oriented towards truth. But okay, now I'm ranting, so I'm going to stop there. Can you be good without God? I've suggested here that the video that I have referenced does not make its case, does not actually support its premises sufficiently, and thus does not succeed. I haven't particularly argued for one alternative, although I've laid out several different alternatives that seem to me to succeed, at least partially, beyond what the argument gives them credit for. So that's what I have for you. All right. Thank you very much.